If I kept a fast and prayed, my breath and my city would kill me. My breath would pour kerosene on me and say that I was ominous, that my fasting brought misfortune into the house. One day, I quietly kept a fast, but the next day, she found out. Then, along with her, my husband was also calling me. I was standing in the kitchen, anxious. I could not even explain my helplessness to my husband. I was afraid that if I did, he would leave me. And if my own parents found out the reason for my distance from my husband, they would kill me. My mother-in-law, after assigning me some work, went to a nearby temple, and I stood there, troubled, making tea, wondering how I would go to my room. The day was about to end. I gathered courage, took the tea, and quickly went to my room. I wanted to give my husband the tea and return to the kitchen to complete my work. But my husband stopped me and said, "I come home early for you, but as soon as you see me, you start running away." While drinking tea, my husband asked me to sit beside him. I understood what he wanted. I was cautious about getting close to him. I told my husband that his mother had asked for dinner early, so I was going to cook. My explanation made it clear to my husband that, as usual, I was just making excuses to avoid him. He placed the teacup forcefully on the table and looked at me angrily. He said, "You are only trying to avoid coming close to me. There used to be so much love between us before. What has happened now?" I was shaken by my husband's anger. It was not even his fault. Ours was a love marriage. And after marriage, we had accepted each other completely, with all our flaws and virtues. A year had passed since our marriage, and the love between us had grown even more than before. We had no children, but this had never worried us. However, after what I had done, getting close to my husband had become difficult for me. My husband thought that I had grown tired of him and had started taking an interest in another man. I was aware of his thoughts, and his fear was evident, but I could not explain anything to him. However, what he was thinking was absolutely untrue. My husband was also filled with anger, and despite my repeated explanations, he did not let me go to the kitchen and forcibly kept me in the room. I became terrified of being close to my husband and tried to stop him. My distance from him was making him suspicious. I knew that my husband now deliberately came home early, and despite my refusals, he forcefully came close to me. This had been happening ever since one day when my husband came home early for some work. I was sitting in my room at the time when my husband suddenly entered. I panicked and quickly turned off my mobile and hid it, but my husband had already noticed my actions. At first, he kept asking in astonishment why I had hidden my mobile, but I firmly stood my ground and told him that it was just a misunderstanding. There was nothing in my mobile that I needed to hide. My husband tried to take my mobile, but I had already locked it. When I tried to leave the room, my husband stopped me and got angry. And when, in his anger, he moved toward me while arguing, I became frightened and started pleading with him not to come near me. My reaction startled my husband. He was shocked and wondered what had suddenly happened to me. I was truly distressed. I pushed my husband away from me. My behavior was so strange that my husband felt I was getting fed up with him. I was his wife, and our marriage had been of our own choice. Now, all of a sudden, when I started keeping my distance, my husband became fearful that his wife was taking an interest in another man. He started forcing himself on me and did not listen to any of my explanations. I was so heartbroken that I did not respond to anything my husband said until late at night, nor did I forgive him when he tried to make amends. I kept crying with my face hidden, and my husband's confusion grew even more because of my behavior. That day, because of one mistake of mine, a seed of doubt was planted in my husband's mind. From that day on, My husband started coming home suddenly in the afternoon and would claim his right over me. Every time, he would see me clutching my head and crying, which only made him more frustrated. I became troubled watching my husband grow more stubborn by the day. I did not want a day to come when, in his anger, my husband would misunderstand me and cut off our relationship forever. I wanted to explain my helplessness to him. I needed his support, and I was certain that if anyone in this world could stand by me in every hardship, it was only my husband. But the situation was such that even telling my husband the truth made me fearful. Every day he would force himself on me, proving that as long as I remained stubborn, he would continue doing the same. He would come home whenever he pleased. When I tried to shame him, he would get even more furious and say, "You are my wife. You cannot stop me. Fix your mind." My husband was certain that, despite wanting to, I was unable to explain the reason behind my behavior. But now, hiding the truth was no longer possible. One morning, as soon as my husband left, my mother-in-law called me over and began scolding me. She said, "It has only been a year since your marriage, and you've already started showing your true colors. Every day, my son rushes home for you, but you must be saying something to him that makes him leave in anger." I became anxious. Now even my mother-in-law had started doubting me. If I kept piling lies upon lies, it would become impossible to handle the situation. I told my mother-in-law that she was mistaken. I assured her that if I was not keeping her son happy, he would not come home early every day. I suggested that perhaps he was facing some issues in his business. My mother-in-law stared at me for a while, then suddenly said, "Daughter-in-law, I have lived long enough to tell by a person's demeanor what is going on in their mind." I was still trying to understand what she meant when she suddenly said something that shook me to my core. I stared at her in shock and tried to convince her that nothing was wrong. But that evening, when my husband came home, my mother-in-law lashed out at him too. She said, "What kind of a man are you? You can't even control your wife." I stood there, utterly dumbfounded. I thought my husband would clear up his mother's misunderstanding and tell her the truth, but instead, he just stared at me. I broke down in tears under their suspicious gazes. My mother-in-law assumed that my husband wanted children and that I was refusing to give him one. Now the sounds of my husband's forced advances and my tearful pleas to stop had become a daily occurrence. My mother-in-law began to suspect that I was deliberately preventing my husband from having a child. But I was beginning to doubt my husband. He knew that none of this was true, that we simply had not been blessed with a child yet. However, hearing his mother's words, he started resenting me. He said, "Now I understand why you keep pushing me away. You don't want us to have a child." That idea had settled in his mind. Neither he nor his mother could see the truth. And I was so helpless and weak that I couldn't muster the courage to tell them. All day, I kept thinking that I needed to be brave. I had to gather the courage to tell the truth and put an end to this situation. If necessary, I would even leave the house. But every time I saw my husband, I lost my strength because I could not live without him. I waited for his anger to subside, for him to speak to me in a calm and loving manner, just as he used to. Only then could I find the courage to tell him the truth, that my heart had truly changed. I was born in a Hindu household in India. Until my marriage, I was still a follower of the Hindu religion. I married out of love and was happy after the marriage. However, now there were many things that kept bothering me. I often wondered how a God who does not take any physical form and whom we create ourselves with our own hands could be the one to create us, the creator who made us. How could he create us? And what is his true nature? I started seeking answers to these questions but no priest could answer them satisfactorily. Dr. Zakir Naik explained these concepts very clearly in one of his videos. I saw a video in which Dr. Zakir Naik proved from our own scriptures that there is only one God, and He is the master of all. The idols we used to worship were made of clay. My heart changed after watching these videos, and secretly, I began to understand Islam. My heart began to feel peace. I didn't want to tell my husband because I was afraid he would get angry and forbid me from watching such videos. Then Ramadan came, and after learning from those videos, I recited the Shahada, embraced Islam, and started fasting. I began studying Islam. I wanted to gain enough knowledge to prove to my husband that Islam is the true religion. But one day, while I was fasting, my husband came home early. When he came near me, I became scared because I knew that during fasting, a married couple is not allowed to have relations. But I couldn't tell my husband everything, ruining my fast. Every day, he would force me, making my fast worthless, and I would cry, helpless and in pain. I prayed a lot to Allah, asking for the strength to tell my husband the truth. If he left me for becoming a Muslim, I was ready to leave him. But the fear of being separated from him always stopped me. My parents were also Hindus, and I couldn't tell them anything either. After a few days, my husband's anger started to subside, but by then, my mother-in-law had added fuel to the fire. My husband now had a new excuse. Day and night, both, he and his mother would keep insisting that I didn't want to give him children, and that's why I was avoiding him. I started becoming a victim of this situation. When I tried to explain to my husband, he kept repeating the same thing, that we needed to have children for peace to return to the house, and only then would the fighting end. Now I was terrified that I might never have children. At this point in my life, I wanted to hold myself together. I knew that the improvement in our relationship could only happen if we had children. But having children became a trial for me. I was a Muslim, and my husband was Hindu, until I could convert my husband to Islam. Having children would only complicate things further. I didn't want my husband to take the child from me after its birth and throw me out of the house, leaving my child to grow up under a Hindu father's influence. So, every time the subject of children came up, instead of agreeing, I stayed silent. My silence had begun to push my husband away. He started arguing with me, saying that I had changed. Before marriage, I had made promises of love and sworn to stay with him forever, and he still stood by those vows. But I had withdrawn from all my words. I remained distressed, wondering how to solve my predicament. I was neither telling my husband, nor was it possible to hide it any longer. One day, I gathered the courage and told my husband the entire truth. He was left stunned upon hearing that I had become a Muslim and stared at me in disbelief. He thought I was joking. I tried to convince him to become a Muslim as well. I assured him of my love and told him that I didn't want to leave him either, which is why he should accept Islam so that we could stay together for life. But upon hearing this, he became extremely angry and started beating me severely. Even when I screamed in pain, he did not stop. My mother-in-law, alarmed by my cries, began knocking on our room's door in panic. However, my husband furiously told her to leave. Contrary to what I had expected, he had lost all control in his rage and kept repeating that I must revert to Hinduism. Otherwise, he would not let me leave this house as a Muslim. In fact, he would kill me. Fear crept into me as I saw the madness in my husband's eyes. Fear crept into me as I witnessed my husband's madness. But I had already accepted Allah as my God with all my heart. That is why it became impossible for me to accept the Hindu religion again. I kept refusing, and my husband kept beating me. I was wounded, My husband beat me until he was exhausted, and I silently kept shedding tears. Now, I was trapped. If I had left quietly without informing my husband, I might have had a chance. But now that he knew the truth, he had become even more possessive. I began praying to Allah for help, and Allah heard my prayers. The next day, when my husband left for work, he locked me inside the room and strictly instructed his mother not to let me step outside. I remained silent in the room, praying. I wished that my husband would not return home early that day. It was the 11th fast of Ramadan, and I wanted to complete the rest of my fasts in peace. I had already made up my mind that if my husband tried to force himself on me again, I would tell him clearly that our relationship no longer existed. But that day, I didn't have to do anything. My husband did not return home on his own feet. His lifeless body was brought home. Those who brought him said that he was on the road near the house when a speeding car ran over him and drove away. His mother was struck with grief. I had gained. My freedom and my hardships had also ended. Since I didn't have the courage to leave my husband, Allah had intervened and done more than I could have. However, I still felt sorrow. I regretted that my husband never got the chance to recite the Kalma. He remained a Hindu till his last breath, despite all my efforts to make him understand. He had sworn never to leave his religion. He kept shaming me for abandoning the faith of my ancestors. I wept in sorrow over his misguidance. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, was on the verge of losing her sanity. Her only young son had died, and she started cursing me. Crying, she blamed me, saying that her son's life ended because of me, that I had tormented him so much that he could not live in peace, and that his distress had led to this accident. I remained silent, even at my mother-in-law's anger. I understood that a mother mourning her young son's death was speaking out of grief. I had no idea what was going through her mind. I had already decided that after my husband's final rites, I would quietly leave that house. If only I had known what was going on in my mother-in-law's mind. Even in the presence of the guests, I would have left the house, but I remained seated among them. When we reached the open prayer ground where my husband's body was to be cremated, I went along as well. Ever since I had become a Muslim, these rituals had started to feel distressing to me. I was deeply troubled that my husband was being burned after his death. If my husband had become a Muslim, I would have fought with everyone to ensure that his funeral was conducted with dignity and that he was buried in a graveyard. But now, out of fear of becoming a spectacle, I remained silent. My husband's behavior had already made me realize that no one would ever accept my conversion to Islam, and I would be killed for it. My parents were strict and arrogant Hindus, and my mother-in-law was no different. The only person in this world who had shown me some leniency was my husband, but even he had not supported me. I stood silently, my head lowered. They were about to set my husband's body on fire, when suddenly I screamed. My mother-in-law had grabbed me, dragged me through the crowd, and shouted something that left everyone in shock. I stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. She had lost her mind. She was screaming that I should be burned along with her son. I panicked and tried to free myself. My family was present there as well. My father stepped forward and saved me. The crowd began trying to reason with my mother-in-law, telling her that she was making a senseless spectacle and that a living person could not be burned. But she started fighting with everyone and shouted that it was because of me that her son had died. She blamed me for making his last days miserable. If she could marry for love, why can't she die with him? She raged. She desperately tried to convince everyone to burn me alive as well, but my family and the other relatives intervened, trying to make her understand that she was wrong, that if her son had been alive, he would never have wanted this. I couldn't comprehend why my mother-in-law was behaving this way. When I cautiously looked at her, she glared at me with pure hatred. A shiver ran down my spine. I thought she was mourning her son's death, that she wanted to punish me because she believed I was responsible for his suffering and depression before he died. But the way she looked at me shocked me. A grieving mother does not look the ways she did at that moment. After much persuasion and my family's intervention, she finally let me go and fell silent. Once everything was over, she took everyone back to her house. My in-laws' house was enormous, and my mother-in-law. For the sake of appearances, once all the guests had left, my parents were asked to stay. After what my mother-in-law had done, openly declaring that I should be burned alive, we didn't feel comfortable staying. That woman had completely unsettled us. But she pleaded and begged so much that my parents decided to stay for a few days, thinking it wouldn't be right to leave her completely alone in the house. For the next 2 or 3 days, my father stayed, and during this time, my mother-in-law took such good care of me that I was utterly shocked. I couldn't understand why she kept changing her behavior so drastically. One day, she spoke to me sorrowfully and said, "Forgive me. I was overwhelmed by the grief of my son's death. You two used to fight a lot, and whenever I asked him what was wrong, he would just sigh and say, 'She has changed.' Thinking about my son's pain, I became furious that the one who had been betrayed was dead, while the one who had abandoned him was still alive. Then, in embarrassment, she admitted, 'I feel ashamed of how emotional I became.' Her words convinced me, and I forgave her. I tried to assure her that I had never been unfaithful to her son, that she had misunderstood me. My mother-in-law accepted my explanation and started treating me lovingly. I believed that she had truly let go of her resentment in her moment of emotional distress, but I didn't realize that even then, she was deceiving me. She cared for me like a beloved daughter, and when my parents prepared to leave, I also began packing my things to go with them. But my mother-in-law suddenly clung to me, crying, "After losing my son, am I now left completely alone?" She sobbed. "Please don't leave me yet. Your presence gives me comfort. I am old and sick. As my son's wife, you are entitled to his inheritance. This house is yours too. Don't leave your home." I was lost in thought. Now that I had become a Muslim, the idea of returning to my parents' home made me anxious. If they found out about my conversion, they would imprison me, just as my husband had. Staying in this big, empty house with an elderly woman seemed like an easier choice. At least this way, I could occasionally meet my parents, and no one would interfere with my prayers. I was foolish. I was naive enough to fall for this woman's false tears. My parents, too, were convinced the moment they heard that I would inherit such a large house. Their greed overpowered everything else, and they left me behind without hesitation. As soon as the house was empty, my elderly mother-in-law locked herself in her room. I went to mine as well. I will now provide an accurate word-for-word translation, while preserving the original meaning, tone, and structure. I went to the place where I used to live with my husband. As soon as I found myself alone, I became sad, remembering my husband. A person worries about the afterlife for the one they love. Ever since I understood Islam, I used to worry about my husband. I had thought that I would convince him at the right opportunity, but his life was short. Now, I began to worry about my parents and mother-in-law. I started praying, "Oh Allah, guide them." A few days passed peacefully in this house, but then that woman started behaving strangely. Often while I was working in the kitchen, I felt that she was staring at me. When I turned around to look, she would avert her gaze. I started to get worried that if she realized I had become a Muslim, it would be a problem. One day when I entered the kitchen, I smelled a strong scent of petrol. Frightened, I stepped out of the kitchen. She was sitting outside and said to me, "Make food quickly. I am hungry." When I went back into the kitchen, I started sniffing everywhere. The smell of petrol was strongest near the stove. It was extremely strong. When I observed closely, my hair stood on end. There was dampness near the stove rack, and on the floor, where one would stand, petrol had been sprinkled there. If I had lit the fire, flames would have spread everywhere, and survival would have been impossible for me. Terrified, I turned around to see her standing right at the kitchen door, glaring at me. With intense hatred, I was stunned. That was when I realized that she was the one who had sprinkled the petrol. And now, by asking me to cook quickly, she wanted to make me the victim of an accident. From the day of her son's death, she had wanted to kill me. But what I could not understand was why she was so determined to kill me. When I tried to leave the kitchen under some pretext, she angrily shut the door. More than her actions, her words shocked me. She said, "The day my son hit you, I heard everything he said. You did not just betray my son, but you also abandoned your religion. He wanted to punish you, but my son himself died." With hatred, she continued, "I would have killed you right then, but others got in the way, so I had to stay silent for a few days." Her tone had changed. She kept talking while I listened in sorrow. I quickly started pouring water into utensils and splashing it over all the places where petrol had been sprinkled. She said, "If I had let you go, your family would have killed you for abandoning your religion." She said, "Had you changed back, they would have forgiven you, but I do not want that. I will only be able to die in peace after punishing you for betraying my son." As she spoke, she lit a lighter and threw it inside through the window. By that time, I had already poured a lot of water, so the fire did not ignite. After a while, even she was startled and peeked inside the kitchen to see why the fire hadn't started. I was hiding behind the kitchen door. The woman, astonished, opened the door to find out why the fire hadn't caught. But as soon as she did, I immediately pushed her. She stumbled and fell to the floor, while I ran out of the house as fast as I could. There was a Muslim neighborhood close to our house. I ran and reached there. When I approached some Muslims who were coming out of a mosque, I tearfully told them that I had accepted Islam and that my life was in danger. They took me in and sheltered me in a house. Now, I am officially a Muslim. I don't know how my mother-in-law informed my parents about my escape or how she twisted the story. I am about to marry a Muslim man, but I still live in fear, wondering when my mother-in-law and my family might find me and kill me. I pray that Allah guides them. Viewers, please share your thoughts about this story in the comments box. Thank you.